I've mentioned in previous videos how gas is exchanged across the alveoli, but let's take a look at where that gas is going and how it's being exchanged and how it's being transported throughout the body. So we talked about pulmonary ventilation already, and if you recall, pulmonary ventilation is just inhaling and exhaling. So that's just bringing air in and out of the lungs. But gas exchange with blood has not occurred yet. That occurs during external respiration. So external respiration occurs when there is gas exchange between the alveoli and the capillaries surrounding the alveoli, which are called the pulmonary capillaries. All right, so during inhalation, air enters the lungs, and during external respiration, that air diffuses from the alveolus into the pulmonary capillaries. And the primary gas that diffuses into the pulmonary capillaries is oxygen. At the same time, carbon dioxide from the blood in the pulmonary capillaries is diffusing into the alveoli. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are moving in opposite directions. The oxygenated blood will then be transported from the pulmonary capillaries back to the heart and then sent out through the aorta through arteries to the systemic capillaries. The carbon dioxide that went into the lungs will be exhaled the next time the lung volume decreases. Internal respiration occurs between the systemic capillaries and the systemic tissues. So the oxygenated blood that went back to the heart through the pulmonary veins is then transported out through the aorta, then to arteries, and then arterioles until they reach systemic capillary beds. And these are the capillary beds that are found in most of the organs and tissues in the body. So internal respiration is the exchange of gases between systemic capillaries and systemic tissues. Oxygen primarily diffuses out of the blood in the systemic capillaries into the systemic tissues. So it's going out of the blood into the cells. The cells and the tissues then use oxygen for cellular respiration to make energy in the form of ATP. Recall that carbon dioxide is formed as a byproduct of cellular respiration, and that carbon dioxide then diffuses from the systemic tissues into the systemic capillaries. So at most of the body tissues, you have oxygen diffusing from the blood into the cells, and then the cells use that oxygen to make ATP, and then carbon dioxide diffuses from the cells and the tissues back into the blood. That deoxygenated blood is then transported from the systemic capillaries through venules and veins back to the heart, where it's then sent through the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries to the lungs to drop that carbon dioxide off and pick up more oxygen, and that's how the cycle restarts. In addition to gas exchange, the gas also has to be transported in the blood so that all of the structures in the body are able to get access to that oxygen. So oxygen, most of it is bound to a protein molecule called hemoglobin found in erythrocytes, which are also known as red blood cells. Although some of the oxygen also just dissolves in the plasma, but hemoglobin is the main way that oxygen is transported throughout the body. Carbon dioxide can also be transported by binding to hemoglobin in erythrocytes, and some of it is dissolved in the plasma just like oxygen is. But most of it is actually converted to something called bicarbonate. And bicarbonate helps to buffer the blood in order to maintain a stable pH. So we mentioned a little bit about how breathing rate can help to maintain a homeostatic pH by either increasing how much carbon dioxide is kept in the blood or decreasing how much carbon dioxide is in the blood. And bicarbonate is one of the intermediate molecules that is involved in that buffering system in order to maintain that normal pH. Now, Different things can affect our respiration. We've already talked about some factors that affect our respiration, but another one that we will talk about here is how altitude affects your respiration. So altitude just refers to how far away from sea level you are. So how far away are you from the surface of the earth? So as you go up in altitude, there's less atmospheric pressure. And remember we talked about the interaction between pressures that results in inhalation or exhalation. So if you're changing the atmospheric pressure, that's also going to change how respiration and pulmonary ventilation occurs. So as you go up in altitude or up in elevation, the pressure of oxygen decreases, and so oxygen diffuses into the blood at a lower rate than it would if you were at sea level. And you can see these numbers on the picture here. So we've got a fake mountain, and altitude is going up from sea level, which is right on the surface of the earth, going up to 30,000 feet. So at sea level, there is kind of 100% oxygen. Well, the air isn't 100% oxygen, but if we set this at the baseline of 100%, if we go up to 5,000 feet, we're now at an 84% amount of oxygen level compared to what we had at sea level. Now, to give you an idea, Phoenix is about 1,500 feet above sea level, and Flagstaff is at about 7,000 feet above sea level. So Flagstaff probably has about 15 to 20% less oxygen in the air than we have here in Phoenix. If you go up higher and higher, the higher you go, the less oxygen there is. And so you can imagine that it's a lot harder to breathe at these higher elevations than it is at lower elevations. And we can even notice a difference if we just go up to Flagstaff for the day. Typically, if you can do a really rigorous hike at sea level, if you then go up in elevation, you can't do as rigorous of a hike because your body isn't able to take in oxygen as efficiently as it's used to, and therefore you can't make ATP or energy as efficiently as you're used to as well. Now, our bodies can adapt to our environment to a degree. So, so let's take a look real quick at something that happens if you go up in altitude too quickly. There's something called acute mountain sickness, or it's also called altitude sickness, and it typically occurs above 8,000 feet above sea level. And it occurs when you go up too fast. So for example, when we drive from Phoenix to Flagstaff, we are gaining several thousand feet in elevation in a relatively short time span. And because of that, our bodies kind of experience a shock, if you will, because we're going from the amount of oxygen we're used to in the air to having less oxygen available to us. If we go up too high in altitude too quickly, then we can get symptoms of altitude sickness, which includes nausea, vomiting, fatigue, lightheadedness, feeling disoriented, nosebleeds, and increased pulse. And if it gets too extreme, you can get cerebral edema. Edema means swelling, and cerebral means brain. So the brain can start swelling, and the lungs can start swelling, and this can lead to death. So first, the person typically goes into a coma, which would then lead to them dying if the problem isn't fixed. The main treatments for altitude sickness are descending to a lower altitude, so going back down closer to sea level, or giving supplemental oxygen. And so that oxygen helps to make up for the lack of oxygen in the air. Now our body can acclimate based on how much oxygen in the air there is to a degree. So remember that erythrocytes, or red blood cells, are the structures that are primarily responsible for transporting oxygen through the blood. So the more erythrocytes you have, the more hemoglobin you have, the more oxygen you can carry in your blood. So if you go up to a higher altitude, your body can start making more red blood cells in order to increase your oxygen transport. The problem is that this takes time. It might take a couple of weeks for your body to make enough additional erythrocytes to make up for the change in oxygen in the atmosphere. So if you're driving up to Flagstaff for the day, your body's not going to be able to acclimate. But if you move to Flagstaff, over time, your body will develop more red blood cells to help you acclimate to the environment of Flagstaff. Now, one example I'd like to give is trying to climb Mount Everest. So Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth. And it's very, very dangerous to climb. And one reason why it's dangerous to climb is because it's very, very high in altitude. You can't just go to Mount Everest and climb it in a day. It actually takes several weeks or possibly even months in order to do so. And that's because there are multiple base camps involved in climbing Mount Everest. So what you do is you hike up to the first base camp, and you have to camp out there for a couple of weeks. And you do this so the body can start making more of those red blood cells to help you acclimate to the lower oxygen at that elevation. Once you've acclimated at the first base camp, you then climb up to the second base camp, and then you've got to hang out there for a few weeks in order for your body to make more red blood cells to acclimate to the decrease in oxygen in the air. After you acclimate at the second base camp, you go up to a third base camp, hang out there for a few weeks, and then go up to a fourth base camp, hang out there for a few more weeks, and then from there you can try to reach the summit or the peak of the mountain during a day trip. And even with these several weeks of acclimation and allowing your body to make more erythrocytes, a lot of climbers have to take supplemental oxygen with them. So they have to take kind of like a scuba tank of oxygen so that they can breathe as they get to the top. And a lot of people die trying to get to the top of Mount Everest. And a lot of them die because they start to become delirious from not having enough oxygen in their bodies. And that can lead to poor decision making, freezing to death, disorientation, which can lead to kind of dangerous conditions associated with hiking. So even with all this acclimation, it's still probably not a good idea to go climb Mount Everest because there's a good chance that you're not going to make it home.